The elevator doors closed with a soft metallic whisper, and for a brief moment there was only silence, the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound itself, as Jonathan Mercer stood beside Emily Parker and watched the glowing floor numbers descend one by one, each level pulling them further away from the world of glass offices and structured schedules into something far less predictable. Emily stood close to him now, her small hands still gripping the straps of her worn backpack, her eyes fixed on the floor indicator as if it might give her answers faster than words ever could, and Jonathan noticed how quiet she had become, not the silence of calm, but the silence of a child trying not to break down in front of a stranger she barely knew. He glanced down at her briefly, his expression still controlled but his mind already moving faster than it had in any meeting that morning, because there was something about the way she had said it, something about the phrase "she did not wake up" that refused to leave his thoughts. When the elevator finally reached the lobby, the doors opened to a rush of city noise, horns outside, footsteps echoing through the marble entrance, and the distant sound of a doorman greeting guests, but Jonathan moved through it all without hesitation, guiding Emily gently toward the exit as if the entire world had narrowed into a single destination. Outside, the morning air was crisp, around 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and a black vehicle was already waiting at the curb, engine running, door opened by a uniformed driver who seemed surprised to see a child accompanying his usual passenger. Jonathan did not explain. He simply helped Emily into the back seat before stepping in beside her, and as the car pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, the city unfolding through tinted windows like a moving painting of steel and glass, Emily finally spoke again, her voice smaller now. "She was sleeping when I went to school. I thought she would wake up like always, but she did not." And Jonathan listened without interrupting, his hands resting loosely but tensely in his lap, because he knew instinctively that this was not just a child exaggerating fear, it was something far more fragile. They drove through Manhattan streets, passing yellow taxis, delivery trucks, and pedestrians wrapped in coats, and every few seconds Emily would glance out the window as if checking whether reality had changed, then back down at her hands as if grounding herself. Jonathan finally asked gently, "Did you try calling anyone else in your home?" And Emily shook her head slowly. "We do not have many people," she said, and that simple sentence landed heavier than expected, causing Jonathan to glance away for a moment, something tightening in his chest that he could not immediately name. The car turned onto a quieter street in a less polished part of the city, buildings older, sidewalks narrower, life less curated, and Emily pointed suddenly. "That one?" she said, her voice sharper now, and Jonathan looked up to see a small apartment building with worn brick and faded window frames, a place that looked like it had seen too many winters without repair. The driver pulled over smoothly, and Jonathan stepped out first, adjusting his coat as he looked up at the building, then turned to help Emily down, noticing how her steps hesitated at the sidewalk as if she was afraid the ground might not support what she was about to face. Together they approached the entrance, and as Jonathan reached for the door handle, he realized with quiet certainty that whatever waited inside would not only change this morning, but would change the way he understood everything he thought he controlled. The moment Jonathan Mercer pushed open the worn entrance door of the apartment building, a faint creak echoed through the narrow hallway, followed by the distant sound of a dripping faucet somewhere deeper inside, and the air immediately felt different from the world he had just left behind, heavier, quieter, as if time itself moved more slowly here. Emily Parker stepped in first, hesitating at the threshold, her small shoes touching the faded tile floor as she looked around like she was afraid the building might respond to her presence, and Jonathan followed closely, his eyes adjusting to the dim lighting of the hallway where old mailboxes lined one wall and a flickering ceiling bulb struggled to stay alive. Emily did not speak at first, she simply walked forward with uncertain steps, leading him down a narrow corridor until she stopped in front of a door marked with a faded number, her hand rising halfway before falling again as if she suddenly lost the courage to knock. Jonathan noticed that immediately, and for the first time since they met, his voice softened even further. "It is okay. I am here with you," he said, though he was not entirely sure if those words were meant for her or for himself, and after a long pause, Emily finally reached up and knocked twice, the sound barely audible but enough to break the stillness. What followed was silence, not immediate movement, not an answer, just silence stretching long enough for Emily's breathing to grow uneven. her fingers tightening around her backpack straps again, and Jonathan felt that familiar tightening in his chest return. Sharper now because silence in situations like this rarely meant nothing. He stepped slightly forward, raising his hand as if to knock again, but before he could, the door slowly opened a few inches, revealing a dimly lit interior where curtains blocked most of the morning light, and the outline of a living space that felt still and untouched. Emily immediately called out softly, "Mom?" But there was no response, and Jonathan, without stepping fully inside yet, scanned the room from where he stood, noticing a folded blanket. On a couch, a half-filled glass of water on a table, and a quietness that did not feel temporary. He exchanged a glance with Emily, who now looked up at him with eyes that were trying very hard not to understand what her fear was suggesting, and Jonathan gently stepped inside, his shoes pressing against a slightly worn carpet as he moved toward the living room. His attention focused on the couch where someone was resting, or not resting as it appeared. Emily followed right behind him, her voice breaking slightly as she said again, "Mom, wake up." But still there was no reaction, and Jonathan raised his hand slowly, not touching anything yet, simply observing carefully, his experience telling him that something here required immediate attention. He immediately took out his phone, his movements controlled but urgent, and dialed emergency services, his voice steady as he provided the address while keeping his eyes on the situation in front of him, then crouched slightly beside Emily, who had now gone completely still, as if the world had paused inside her. The dispatcher confirmed help was on the way within minutes, and Jonathan placed the phone back into his pocket, then looked at Emily with a calm that barely held back concern. "They are coming right now," he said, and for a brief moment, Emily did not respond, only stared forward as if trying to process something too big for her age. Outside, faint sirens could already be heard in the distance, growing slowly louder, and Jonathan remained by her side, realizing that whatever happened next would no longer be just about urgency, but about understanding a reality that a 7-year-old should never have had to face alone. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder through the open window, bouncing off the narrow walls of the apartment until the entire space felt like it was vibrating with urgency, and Jonathan Mercer remained crouched beside Emily Parker, his attention divided between the stillness of the living room and the growing certainty that help was seconds away. Emily stood frozen in place, her small hands now hanging loosely at her sides, her eyes locked on her mother as if staring long enough might change what she was seeing, and Jonathan gently placed a steady hand near her shoulder without touching too firmly, his voice low and controlled. "Emily, the emergency team is almost here." But she did not respond, only swallowed hard as if trying to hold herself together through sheer will alone. Within moments, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, followed by a firm knock, and then the door swung open as 2 paramedics entered quickly with professional focus, their eyes scanning the room in seconds as they assessed the situation without hesitation. One of them, a middle-aged man with calm authority, moved immediately toward the living room couch while the other began preparing equipment, and Jonathan stepped aside to give them space, his posture still composed but his eyes tracking every movement with intense attention. Emily shifted slightly closer to Jonathan now, instinctively seeking something stable in the middle of the sudden activity, and for the first time she whispered, "Mom," her voice breaking just enough to reveal how long she had been holding her fear inside. The paramedic knelt beside Sarah Parker and checked for responsiveness, his expression steady but focused, asking simple questions as the second paramedic placed monitoring equipment nearby, and the room that had felt frozen only moments earlier now filled with soft instructions, measured movements, and quiet urgency. Jonathan watched carefully, noticing the subtle exchange of glances between the medical professionals, the kind that indicated assessment without needing words, and he realized that whatever was happening was not something simple or temporary. Emily tugged slightly at Jonathan's sleeve, her voice barely audible. "Is she going to wake up now?" And Jonathan paused for a moment before answering honestly but gently, "They are doing everything they can right now." Though internally he understood that uncertainty had already entered the room and would not leave easily. The paramedic spoke softly into his radio, requesting additional support as a precaution, and within seconds the hallway outside filled with more footsteps, confirming that this situation required more than a routine response. Jonathan stood slowly, giving space but remaining close enough to ensure Emily was not alone, and as the second team entered, the apartment suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were closing in around the weight of the moment. One of the responders asked Jonathan a few brief questions, confirming what Emily had reported, while another gently guided her away from the immediate area, offering reassurance in calm, practiced tones. But Emily resisted slightly at first, her eyes never leaving her mother, until Jonathan softly knelt beside her again and said, "Stay with me for a moment, they need space to help her." And after a long pause she finally nodded, though her expression remained tense and uncertain. The lead paramedic exchanged a brief, serious look with his colleague, then continued working with steady precision, and Jonathan, despite his experience in controlling high-pressure situations, felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not panic, but the realization that this moment was no longer about schedules or decisions, but about waiting for answers no one could rush, while Emily stood quietly beside him, holding on to hope with the fragile strength only a child in uncertainty can carry. The apartment felt different now, not quieter, not louder, but heavier in a way that made every second stretch longer than it should. As Jonathan Mercer stood near the doorway with Emily Parker still close to him, watching the medical team work with calm precision around her mother, while the soft sounds of monitoring equipment created a steady rhythm that contrasted sharply with the emotional stillness in the room. Emily had not spoken for several minutes, her eyes fixed on her mother as if refusing to accept anything other than the possibility that she would simply open her eyes again, and Jonathan remained beside her, his presence steady but quiet, aware that this was not a moment that could be solved by words alone. One of the paramedics spoke softly to the others and then to Jonathan, explaining that they were preparing to transport Sarah Parker to the nearest hospital for immediate evaluation, their tone professional but careful, and Jonathan simply nodded in understanding, stepping slightly back to allow them space to continue their work. Emily finally moved when she saw the medical team begin to carefully prepare her mother for transport, her small voice breaking through the controlled silence. "Can I go with her?" she asked, her words carrying both fear and hope at the same time, and Jonathan looked down at her for a moment before answering gently, "Yes, you will not be alone," and something in his response seemed to steady her just enough for her to take a small step forward. Within minutes, the apartment filled with coordinated movement as the paramedics lifted Sarah onto a stretcher with careful precision, securing everything as they prepared to move toward the hallway, and Emily instinctively followed, staying close but not interfering, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. Jonathan walked beside them as they moved through the narrow corridor, the sound of footsteps echoing against the worn walls, and he noticed how Emily kept one hand slightly raised as if she wanted to reach out but was afraid to let go of what little control she still had. When they reached the building entrance, the cool morning air from outside met them, and an ambulance was already waiting at the curb, its rear doors open, interior lights glowing softly, and the paramedics carefully guided the stretcher inside with practiced coordination. Emily hesitated at the threshold of the vehicle, suddenly overwhelmed by the realization that everything was changing too quickly, and Jonathan gently placed a steady hand near her shoulder again, this time not to guide her but to reassure her presence, saying softly, "Stay close, you can ride with her?" And she nodded quietly before stepping inside the ambulance without looking away from her mother. Jonathan followed immediately after, closing the distance between uncertainty and action as the doors shut behind them with a firm sound, sealing them inside the moving vehicle. As the ambulance began to move, the city outside blurred through small windows, sirens softly cutting through traffic as they made their way through Manhattan streets. And inside the vehicle the atmosphere was controlled but tense, with the medical team continuing their careful monitoring while Emily sat close to her mother, holding onto the edge of the stretcher as if it was the only stable point in her world. Jonathan sat slightly back, observing everything with quiet focus, realizing that this morning had shifted into something far beyond a chance encounter, and as he looked at Emily's small, determined silhouette beside her mother, he understood that the next answers would not come quickly, but they would come in a place where waiting was the only thing anyone could do. The ambulance doors closed with a firm metallic sound as it pulled away from the hospital entrance, merging into the steady flow of Manhattan traffic, and inside the moving vehicle the world felt narrowed down to breathing machines, quiet instructions from medical staff, and the tense silence of waiting, while Jonathan Mercer sat slightly to one side observing everything with a focused calm that masked the weight building inside him. Emily Parker remained beside her mother, her small hands still gently holding onto the edge of the stretcher, as if physical contact alone could anchor her to reality. Her eyes fixed on Sarah Parker's face with a desperate hope that refused to disappear despite everything unfolding around her. The paramedic in the back continued monitoring vital signs with steady professionalism, occasionally exchanging quiet updates with the driver through a radio connection, and Jonathan listened carefully without interrupting, understanding enough to know that every word mattered even when it was spoken softly. Emily leaned closer at one point, whispering, "Mom, we are going to the hospital now, you will wake up there." Her voice fragile but full of belief, and Jonathan noticed how she did not look away even after speaking, as if afraid that silence might take away what little connection she still had. The ride continued through the city, passing intersections, traffic lights, and rows of tall buildings that reflected the early daylight, and Jonathan found himself studying Emily more than the streets outside, noticing how a child so young was carrying something far too heavy for her age without fully breaking under it. After several minutes, the ambulance began to slow as they approached the hospital entrance, where medical staff were already waiting outside under bright overhead lights, ready to receive the incoming patient, and the doors opened once again to a rush of controlled movement as Sarah Parker was carefully transferred out with coordinated precision. Emily followed immediately, refusing to let go of her position near her mother, while Jonathan stayed close behind, his presence steady but unobtrusive as they moved through the automatic sliding doors into the emergency area. The interior of the hospital was bright, clean, and filled with quiet urgency, where voices remained calm but movements were fast, and Sarah was quickly guided toward a treatment room as nurses and doctors coordinated their next steps. Emily stood just outside the doorway at first, hesitant to enter fully, her eyes scanning everything as if trying to understand what all the unfamiliar equipment meant, and Jonathan gently stepped beside her, speaking softly. "You can stay here, but they are going to take care of her now." And Emily nodded slightly without looking away from the room. Moments later, a doctor approached with a calm expression, asking a few brief questions about what had happened earlier in the day, and Jonathan answered clearly and carefully, while Emily listened without speaking, absorbing every word as if each detail mattered more than anything else in the world. When the doctor finished and returned to the treatment room, Jonathan remained standing beside Emily in the hallway, where the noise of the hospital continued around them but felt distant, compared to the stillness between them. Emily finally sat down on a nearby chair, her small frame folding inward as she rested her hands in her lap, and Jonathan stayed standing for a moment before lowering himself beside her, matching her level instead of towering above her, and together they waited in silence, the kind of silence that holds both fear and hope at the same time, as the unseen work inside the room continued behind closed doors that neither of them could open, but both of them refused to walk away from. Hours had passed inside the hospital waiting area, where the lighting remained constant and the air carried the faint scent of antiseptic, and Jonathan Mercer remained seated beside Emily Parker without moving from his position, as if leaving might somehow break the fragile connection holding the moment together, while Emily sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the closed doors where her mother had been taken earlier. Neither of them spoke for long stretches of time, and the silence between them was not empty but filled with unspoken questions that neither felt ready to voice, as the steady rhythm of footsteps, distant announcements, and rolling carts continued around them in a way that made the world outside their situation feel distant and unrelated. At one point, Emily shifted slightly in her chair, looking up at Jonathan with tired eyes and asking softly, "Do you think she will wake up soon?" And Jonathan paused before answering, choosing his words carefully as he replied, "The doctors are doing everything they can right now," knowing that honesty in moments like this had to be gentle rather than absolute. Emily nodded, slowly, as if trying to accept something too large for her understanding, then returned her gaze to the doors, holding on to hope in a way that felt both strong and fragile at the same time. A nurse eventually approached them with a calm expression, asking them to follow her toward a consultation room, and Jonathan immediately stood, guiding Emily with a light but reassuring presence as they moved through the hospital corridors filled with soft white light and controlled movement. Inside the consultation room, the atmosphere shifted slightly, becoming more focused and formal as a doctor entered with a file in hand, greeting them briefly before taking a seat across from them, and Jonathan instinctively straightened, his attention sharpening as he prepared to hear whatever information was about to be shared. Emily remained close to him, her small frame leaning slightly inward as if needing physical proximity to feel secure, and the doctor began speaking in a calm, measured tone, explaining that Sarah Parker was currently stable but required further observation and additional tests to determine the exact cause of her condition. Jonathan listened carefully, asking precise follow-up questions when necessary, while Emily remained silent, absorbing every word even though much of it was difficult for her to understand. When the explanation concluded, there was a brief pause in the room, the kind that often follows uncertain news, and Jonathan thanked the doctor before he left, leaving them alone once again in the quiet consultation space. Emily finally exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering slightly as if she had been holding her breath for hours, and Jonathan looked at her and spoke, more softly than before. "She is in the right place now, they are going to take care of her." And Emily nodded again, this time with a small trace of relief mixed with exhaustion. They returned to the waiting area afterward, where time seemed to stretch again, and Jonathan remained beside her without checking his phone or receiving any calls, fully present in a way he rarely allowed himself to be, while Emily leaned back in her chair, still watching the hallway leading to her mother's room, holding on to the quiet belief that the next time those doors opened, everything might finally begin to change. Emily Parker shifted slightly in her chair, her small hands fidgeting in her lap as she kept glancing toward the hallway leading to her mother's room, the soft hum of fluorescent lights above blending with the distant beeping of monitors and occasional rolling carts, creating a rhythm that felt both comforting and tense at the same time, while Jonathan Mercer remained seated beside her, his presence quiet but solid, giving her a sense of stability in the midst of uncertainty. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they waited together, Jonathan occasionally glancing at the hospital clock, noting the slow crawl of the minute hand while trying to stay present for Emily, his mind racing through possible outcomes but his voice never betraying his worry, only offering calm reassurance when she looked up at him with her wide, brown eyes. "Do you think she will be all right?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper, and Jonathan nodded slowly. "They are taking care of her, and they know exactly what to do," he said, his tone steady, aiming to provide hope without creating false certainty, and Emily seemed to take in every word, her body relaxing slightly though her gaze remained fixed on the hallway. The door to her mother's room opened briefly as a nurse peeked out, motioning quietly to them that updates would come soon, and Jonathan gently suggested they sit back down, guiding Emily to adjust her small frame in the chair more comfortably, while she continued to clutch the edge of her backpack as though it were an anchor to the world outside the unknown that lay beyond those closed doors. The soft shuffle of nurses and doctors in the hall created a background rhythm, punctuated by the occasional beep of distant machines, and Jonathan found himself paying attention to every subtle sound, recognizing how much of the information came from observation alone rather than conversation, and Emily, sensing his watchfulness, leaned slightly closer, her presence quiet but comforting, a reminder that even small gestures could hold enormous meaning in moments of high tension. As they waited, Jonathan began asking her gentle questions about what had happened earlier in the day, not to interrupt the seriousness of the moment but to allow her to articulate what she had seen and felt, giving her a sense of agency in a situation that had otherwise left her powerless, and Emily spoke carefully, describing the moment she first discovered her mother unresponsive, the steps she had taken to seek help, and the fear she had felt, each word building a bridge between her anxiety and the practical response that was now unfolding around her. Jonathan nodded after each sentence, offering quiet affirmations without distraction, his attention entirely on her, while the hospital environment continued around them, a blend of controlled urgency and soft efficiency, reinforcing the sense that action was being taken even if they could not see every step. Emily's eyes occasionally flicked to the hallway, imagining her mother's recovery, while Jonathan remained attentive, providing a steady, protective presence, and together they sat in that liminal space between fear and relief, the minutes stretching but each one bringing them incrementally closer to clarity, as they waited for the doors to open again, and for the next chapter of this morning to unfold with careful precision and cautious hope. The steady hum of hospital machinery filled the room as Jonathan Mercer remained seated beside Emily Parker, his eyes trained on the closed doors of her mother's room, where every second felt stretched between hope and uncertainty, and Emily's small hand found his, gripping it lightly yet firmly as if anchoring herself to his presence while the world around them moved at a pace neither could control. She leaned slightly closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think she will be all right?" And Jonathan gave a slow, careful nod, his words measured. "They are doing everything they can, Emily, and she is in the right place now." And the quiet sincerity in his tone seemed to give her a small measure of reassurance, though her eyes remained fixed on the hallway as if willing her mother to appear. Time passed with only the soft shuffle of nurses, the distant paging announcements, and the occasional beep of medical monitors providing background rhythm to the waiting, and Jonathan found himself noticing the subtle changes in Emily's posture, the way her small shoulders shifted slightly, the way her eyes flickered with both fear and determination, a mix of exhaustion and courage that seemed far beyond her 7 years. The door opened briefly and a nurse stepped out, giving a quiet nod to Jonathan and gesturing for them to follow her toward a small consultation room where they could receive an update, and Jonathan rose slowly, offering his hand to Emily, who accepted it without hesitation, her small fingers wrapping around his as they walked together down the brightly lit corridor, the fluorescent lights casting soft reflections on the polished tile floor and highlighting the contrast between the hurried efficiency of hospital staff and the still, tense pace of their personal journey. Inside the consultation room, the doctor greeted them with a calm, measured expression and motioned for them to sit, Jonathan guiding Emily to a chair beside him while he remained seated in front of her, maintaining a protective but unobtrusive presence, and the doctor began speaking in clear, gentle tones, explaining that Sarah Parker was currently stable but still under observation, with further testing required to determine the full nature of her condition, emphasizing that everything possible was being done to ensure her recovery. Jonathan listened carefully, asking follow-up questions as necessary, and Emily remained quiet, absorbing the information, her gaze occasionally flicking to her mother's room through a small window, her body tense but controlled, holding herself together as best she could. When the doctor finished, he offered a reassuring nod before leaving them alone, and Jonathan turned slightly toward Emily, speaking softly. "It will be a little longer, but she is being looked after." And Emily exhaled slowly, a subtle release of tension, her shoulders dropping slightly as she finally allowed herself to lean a little against his side. They returned to the waiting area afterward, Jonathan maintaining a watchful presence while Emily settled into the chair, her small hands folded in her lap, and together they sat in quiet, the ambient sounds of the hospital around them fading into a background hum as they shared the unspoken understanding that patience, presence, and hope were now the most important actions they could take, each second bringing them incrementally closer to the moment when the doors would open again and Sarah Parker's condition would be clearer, a waiting filled with both apprehension and the cautious optimism that had slowly begun to grow between them. Suddenly, the door to the treatment room opened and the doctor stepped out, his expression calm but carrying a weight of seriousness that immediately drew Jonathan Mercer and Emily Parker's attention. And as he approached, Emily instinctively clutched Jonathan's hand a little tighter, her small body leaning slightly against his side for support while her eyes remained locked on the figure who now held the answers they had been waiting for. Jonathan rose slowly to meet the doctor, his posture careful and composed, while Emily shifted her gaze between the doctor and the closed doors of the room, as if silently pleading for reassurance, and the doctor, with a gentle nod, motioned for them to sit and explained in measured tones that Sarah Parker was now stable, her vital signs improving steadily, and that the medical team had been able to address the immediate concern, though continued observation and testing would still be necessary to ensure her full recovery. Emily let out a quiet breath she had been holding, her fingers still intertwined with Jonathan's as she whispered softly, "She is going to be okay." And Jonathan gave a small nod, his eyes reflecting the relief that mirrored her words but tempered with the understanding that the situation was far from over. Yet the immediate danger had passed. The doctor continued to explain in clear, patient language, detailing the steps that had been taken, the precautions that remained in place, and what to expect over the next several hours, and Jonathan listened intently, occasionally asking questions to clarify, while Emily absorbed each word, her wide eyes following the motions of the doctor as he spoke, and with every explanation, her small body seemed to relax slightly, though she remained perched attentively on the edge of the chair, unwilling to let go of the vigilance that had carried her through the morning. After answering their questions, the doctor stepped back, giving a final nod of reassurance, and Jonathan exhaled quietly, his shoulders lowering for the first time since they had arrived, while Emily, still holding his hand, let herself settle into the chair more fully, a tiny smile forming on her lips as the weight of uncertainty eased just enough to allow hope to take hold. Together they moved back toward the waiting area, Jonathan guiding Emily gently while explaining in soft tones what would happen next, that Sarah would remain under careful observation and that they could visit at appropriate times, and Emily nodded, her small hand still in his as they walked slowly down the bright corridor, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished floor, and every step seemed lighter than the last. Once seated again, they allowed themselves a brief moment of quiet, the low murmur of the hospital around them fading into background noise, and Jonathan glanced at Emily, seeing the mix of relief, exhaustion, and cautious optimism in her expression. And he offered a small, comforting smile that she returned with a tentative nod, her brown eyes shining with a fragile but growing sense of security. They sat together in silence, not needing to speak, the waiting area now feeling less intimidating. And in that quiet, Jonathan understood that the bond formed through shared tension and care had shifted something fundamental between them, a connection rooted in trust, presence, and the understanding that some moments required nothing more than patience, compassion, and the willingness to remain beside those who needed you most. The hours passed slowly in the hospital waiting area, with Jonathan Mercer remaining close to Emily Parker, his presence steady and reassuring as she leaned slightly against him, her small hands folded in her lap, eyes still occasionally flicking toward the hallway leading to her mother's room, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead combined with distant footsteps and soft rolling carts created a rhythm that was both calming and tense. Emily spoke softly after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will she be able to talk to me when she wakes up?" And Jonathan nodded, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, Emily, she will, and she will be so happy to see you." And the sincerity in his tone seemed to ease some of the tension in her posture, allowing her to sit back slightly while maintaining her gaze on the corridor as if willing time to move faster. A nurse appeared briefly in the doorway, offering a quiet update, confirming that Sarah Parker remained stable and that further observation would continue, and Jonathan acknowledged her with a small nod, standing slightly to give Emily a sense of space while remaining close enough to provide reassurance, and Emily exhaled slowly, letting some of the weight she had been holding release just enough to allow her shoulders to drop a fraction. The hospital around them moved with controlled urgency, staff passing by with charts and devices, the distant beeping of monitors providing a soft undercurrent of steady activity, and Jonathan noticed how Emily's eyes tracked every movement, absorbing information even when it was not directed at her, as if she were trying to understand and predict what would happen next, her focus unwavering despite her young age and the heavy weight of concern she carried. After several minutes, a doctor emerged from the treatment room, walking toward them with a calm but purposeful stride, and Jonathan rose to meet him while Emily shifted slightly to maintain proximity, her small hand brushing against his arm as if seeking silent assurance, and the doctor greeted them politely before speaking in measured tones, explaining that Sarah Parker was progressing well, her vital signs stable, and that she was beginning to respond to stimuli, though careful monitoring would continue to ensure her full recovery, and Jonathan listened attentively, absorbing every detail while allowing Emily to hear and understand what she could. Emily's eyes brightened slightly at the words, and she whispered, "She is okay." Barely audible but filled with relief, and Jonathan offered a gentle smile in return, his presence calm and grounding as they absorbed the moment together. The doctor answered a few additional questions from Jonathan regarding next steps and potential timelines, and once satisfied, he gave them a reassuring nod before returning to the treatment room, leaving Jonathan and Emily in the quiet consultation space, where they sat together, the soft hum of hospital life surrounding them, a mixture of anticipation and relief settling over both of them. Emily finally leaned fully against Jonathan, a small sigh escaping her lips as tension left her body for the first time in hours, and Jonathan placed a steady hand over hers, letting the connection speak for both of them in silence, as they waited, side by side, knowing that although the morning had been fraught with fear and uncertainty, the immediate crisis had passed, and with careful observation, patience, and the unwavering presence they offered one another, the next chapter of recovery had begun. filling the space with cautious hope and the quiet knowledge that they would face it together. The hospital corridor outside the treatment room was quiet, carrying only the distant hum of machinery and the soft shuffle of nurses passing by, and Jonathan Mercer remained seated beside Emily Parker, his presence steady and grounding, as she leaned slightly against his side. Her small hands folded in her lap and her eyes flicking occasionally toward the closed doors where her mother lay, a mixture of concern and hope reflected in their shared silence. Emily spoke softly after several minutes, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think she remembers me?" And Jonathan gave a slow, careful nod, choosing his words with precision. "Yes, Emily, she will recognize you and she will be so happy to see you." And the gentle reassurance in his tone seemed to ease some of the tension in her posture, allowing her to sit back slightly while still holding on to the focus she had maintained since the morning. Minutes stretched forward with only the quiet rhythm of hospital life. Surrounding them, the distant beeps of monitors and occasional announcements on the intercom creating a soft cadence, and Jonathan noticed how Emily's small frame remained attentive, her body poised to react, eyes wide yet determined as if willing her mother to respond simply through the force of her attention. When the nurse returned briefly to the hallway, giving them a small, calm nod to indicate continued observation, Jonathan rose slowly, guiding Emily gently to shift in her chair for comfort while explaining softly in measured tones what the next steps would be, including continued monitoring, possible tests, and the opportunity for Emily to see her mother soon, and Emily absorbed every word, her small eyes flicking toward the doors as if trying to sense the moment when she would finally be allowed inside. The hallway remained calm but purposeful, staff moving with precise intention, and Jonathan remained a quiet pillar beside Emily, occasionally asking her questions about her morning or what she remembered of their journey so far, not to distract from the seriousness of the situation but to give her a sense of control and engagement, and Emily responded with soft words, her voice steadying with each answer, building a bridge between her fear and the reassurance provided by his presence. After a few more minutes, the doctor emerged again, walking toward them with a measured stride, greeting them with a calm expression that immediately drew their focus. And Jonathan stood carefully to meet him while Emily remained slightly leaning toward him for support. And the doctor explained that Sarah Parker was stable, responsive to stimuli, and showing clear signs of improvement, though observation would continue to ensure complete recovery, and Jonathan listened attentively, absorbing every detail while Emily's gaze remained fixed on the closed doors, a flicker of relief crossing her features at each word of assurance. When the doctor finished, he gave a final nod of reassurance and returned to the treatment room, leaving Jonathan and Emily alone, and Jonathan adjusted his posture to be closer to her level, placing a steady hand lightly on hers, allowing the comfort of presence to speak for both of them as they sat quietly in the waiting area, absorbing the relief, tension, and cautious optimism that now filled the space, and together they remained, side by side, knowing that the most important thing they could do in this moment was wait patiently, hope quietly, and remain present for the person who needed them most. Finally, the door to the treatment room opened fully, and Jonathan Mercer rose quickly, offering Emily Parker a reassuring nod as she took a tentative step forward, her small hand still clasped within his as they approached the threshold together. Inside, Sarah Parker lay propped slightly on a hospital bed, her eyes fluttering open slowly, and the first thing she saw was Emily leaning near her side, her face a mixture of worry and hope, and Jonathan standing close, his presence calm yet attentive, giving her a sense of stability as her awareness returned. Emily's small voice trembled with excitement and relief. "Mom, it is me." And Sarah Parker's lips curved into a faint, yet unmistakable smile as she reached a weak hand toward her daughter, the gesture enough to release the tension that had built over the long hours, and Jonathan watched quietly, recognizing the gravity of this small but profound moment, the bond between mother and child now visible and tangible in the soft squeeze of Emily's hand in return. The nurse stepped back to give them space while offering gentle guidance, explaining that while Sarah would need continued observation, she was responsive and improving, and Jonathan absorbed each word, nodding in acknowledgement while keeping his focus on Emily and her mother, ensuring they were both supported. Emily shifted closer to Sarah, leaning over slightly to brush a few strands of hair from her mother's face, her small hands trembling but steady, and whispered softly, "We were so worried." And Sarah Parker, with a quiet strength that returned gradually, responded with a faint laugh. "I know, I am here now." Her voice weak but full of warmth, filling the room with a calm sense of relief that Jonathan had not realized he needed to feel himself. And Emily exhaled slowly, the tightness in her chest finally easing as she watched her mother respond to her presence. Jonathan stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder while maintaining a calm distance, allowing the mother and daughter to reconnect without intrusion, and the three of them sat in a quiet moment of shared understanding, the hum of medical equipment in the background a soft counterpoint to the emotional resonance in the room. After a few minutes, Sarah Parker looked at Jonathan with gratitude in her eyes, acknowledging silently the presence of someone who had remained steadfast through the uncertainty, and Emily squeezed her mother's hand once more, reinforcing the bond that had held strong through fear and waiting. The nurse returned with a small tray of water and suggested light sips, and Jonathan assisted Emily in offering it carefully, making sure her mother remained comfortable, and each measured movement emphasized patience, care, and attentive presence. Outside the window, the city continued to move, unaware of the delicate restoration taking place within this small hospital room, and as Emily whispered softly, "We stayed together, Mom, we never left." Sarah's eyes glistened with emotion, a mix of relief, gratitude, and recognition, and Jonathan stood quietly behind them, witnessing the healing that words and presence alone had begun to accomplish. The room, though small and softly lit, now carried a sense of safety and completion, a moment in which fear had been met with action, hope, and human connection, and all three of them, mother, daughter, and the steady presence of Jonathan, shared the quiet awareness that the ordeal had passed, and that together they could now begin the journey forward with renewed trust, relief, and the unspoken promise that they would remain present for each other through whatever came next.